And as promised, a very, very special guest, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, a best-selling author, extraordinary diplomat, historian, public servant. Michael Oren, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, John. Thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you. And let's start with one of the most interesting things I got to look at yesterday, your brand new book, The Night Archer. What a remarkable book. And I want to ask you, you've had 3 best-selling nonfiction books in the past. What led you to write a fiction book for the first time?
Well, it's actually not the first time. I've been writing fiction since I was a kid. I've had a couple
No
of
kidding.
novels published. Yeah. And I started as a fiction writer. And as a nonfiction writer, the biggest compliment I ever got was that my nonfiction reads like a novel. I used to love that. But, I've been in government for many years. And it's similar to American government. In parts of Israeli government, you can write, but you can't publish. The President of the United States is not going to publish a book, right?
Right.
Because the idea is you're not going to use your exalted position to advance book sales. But you can write. And every day I get up very early and I write. And I've often loved the form, the genre of short fiction, which on one hand gives you unlimited freedom to be anything, be anywhere, anytime you want to be. On the other hand, it's tremendous discipline. I call it the haiku of fiction. And novelists can write things in 300 pages. A short story writer has to write it in 3 pages. And I love that form.
It is remarkable. And, as you read through, and I got a chance last night to really dig in and read for the first time, these are little stories that say a lot of big things about humanity, the fragility of humanity, the uncertainty of humanity, the goodness of humanity. It just, each anecdote as you hand through these little short stories seems to say something about, just us as humans and all of the challenges and flaws and good sides that we have. What inspires you to do each one of these stories? I mean, where do they come from when
they
you start
come
to
from
put
many
together?
things. As you said, I've had an interesting life, probably a little bit too interesting life. I've been a historian, academic. I've been a diplomat, an ambassador. I've been a soldier for many years. Participated in several wars. Father, husband, grandfather now to 5, and I draw on all of these experiences. But you're absolutely right. I just don't want to tell a story. If I tell a story that's set, for example, in history, and I have a story about conquistadors in the 16th century,
right?
Or sultans even in the 17th century, or about World War II, or the American Civil War, or the American West, which is one of my favorite stories, called Metaxas, set in 1841 on the American frontier.
Right.
I want to delve into them and be as authentic as I can. For example, in that story, Metaxas, about the American frontier, I sat and I read U.S. military correspondence from the 1840s because I wanted to get the language right.
Wow.
I wanted to get their spelling right. But that's not what the story's about. The story is about the human being and the monster in each of us and how we're divided. And so I wanted each story not just to be set and to tell an interesting tale usually with a bit of a twist at the ending, but I do want to make a comment. So I also want to write, I want to be able to have freedom. I want to be able to write mystery stories or ghost stories. As you saw in the collection, I'm very interested in faith. I'm a person of faith, so that's
absolutely.
I can write about God. I can write about Satan, and I can also dwell on these experiences and go deep into them. What does it feel like to be, a soldier in combat?
The Metaxas one is one of the ones I read last night, and you're right. It has that historical authenticity, but it also has a man grappling with the horrors of war, the horrors of violence, the horrors of humanity, the darker side of humanity. When you look at today, where particularly in the United States, there's such a divisive rhetoric, a divisive political system. It seems like mutual destruction is the only object of politics today. What message do you hope readers take from this book about just the cultural and historical times that we're in today?
Well, not to belabor the term, but it's quite literally freedom. I think that in the United States and other parts of the West, there's tremendous pressure on writers and other artists not to exercise their freedom, to narrow their scope over and over and over again, depending on what race they may be, or religion, or sexual orientation.
Right.
And so we're getting narrower and narrower. I think I view this book as sort of like a battle cry of freedom, if you will. It's not an original title, but it is that type of expression of, here I can be anything and anybody, and no one's going to tell me otherwise. And okay, there are risks involved, and maybe I'll get criticized for it. But that in many ways, it's asserting imagination. And there's been a war against imagination in recent years, as you know, a war against creativity. And this is the counterattack, if you will.
Well, you've definitely succeeded. The writing is sensational. I mean, just from a literary standpoint, I was just sucked right into the writing. It just keeps you there. And I think, like you said, each anecdote has almost a different voice, a different theme. But the writing is the thing that just holds everything together. I was very, very impressed. And what's the difference when you free yourself up? And you said you've been a fiction writer since a little boy. What's the difference when you write diplomatic documents, you write correspondence, you write nonfiction, then you suddenly get this extraordinary playground that is fiction? What sort of changes did you do yourself in terms of writing and personality to create that imaginative narrative that you did? Well,
unlike, say, an op-ed that I write pretty much during the week, I write a lot for the press, or even writing a history book. The inspiration for the short stories come to me. I don't go to them. It's like someone knocking on the door and saying, here's a story. And I must tell you, John, my first reaction to almost every one of these stories is, no way. No way. This is too crazy. I can't write.
Right.
I have one story, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, about a tiger who's having a lunch break. And the lunch break, he's eating a person. And it's told from the first person from the tiger. And I asked myself, this idea comes to me, what would a tiger think? Eating a human being. Okay. And, but the story is not really about a tiger and a human being. It's about the way humanity and human beings fit into the cycle of nature.
Yeah.
And whether we are truly part of that cycle of nature. So I'm trying to say something. The whole story is a page and a half. But that was immensely challenging for me. Think about this. Okay, what is this tiger going to be like?
Yeah.
And there are many stories like this. And so these stories come to me, and my first reaction is nuts. And but then sit down at that opposite the empty page of the computer, which is the most frightening thing, really outside of war. It's the most frightening thing in the world.
It is indeed,
and see if it comes to me. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they get thrown off. My wife is my best critic here, and doesn't always pass muster, I must tell you. So it comes from a different part of me. I would say that the history and the op-eds come from my brain, and these come from someplace deeper and different. So, and that's it.
Well, it's a wonderful work of art. I enjoyed it. I only got halfway through last night, but I'm not going to start reading until I get to the last page.
Oh, please, thank you. I'm delighted to hear that.
It's wonderful, and the short form, which is a lost art today. I mean, most of these stories are 1.5 to 3-4 pages tops. And
it's perfect. It's perfect for COVID, people. It's perfect for the lockdown.
It is.
If you've got ADHD and you've run out of things to watch on Netflix, this is the book for you.
It is indeed. I couldn't agree more with you. And well, congratulations on the book, folks. If you haven't had a chance to get a copy, please. I think it went on sale today, so The Night Archer. It is amazing. I highly recommend it. I know it's on Amazon and all the other great places where books are sold. Now, Mr. Ambassador, I want to pivot a little bit because there's been an awful lot of news back in the Middle East, back in the United States. I wonder first if we could get your reaction to the historic deal that was reached. I mean, yesterday we had a flight from Israel to United Arab Emirates. The peace deal between the recognition of UAE of Israel. What's your reaction to that, and what is the next step, fallout, opportunity that comes from that extraordinary moment?
It's a total game changer. The peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates has totally upended 30, 50, even 70 years of assumptions about the Arab-Israeli conflict and how you end it. It's amazing. And you know, there's an entire industry around these assumptions. They're in universities, think tanks, and the media. What were the assumptions? One is Israel had to pay for peace with the land. This goes back to the early 1950s.
It does.
And that was always the assumption. You know, you make peace with Egypt, you got to get back to Sinai. You get peace with Jordan, you got to get back to the Jordan Valley. You got to get peace with Syria. Fortunately, we never did this. Got to get back to Golan Heights. That's the one. This agreement, no payment, no territory. Okay. Second assumption, the core conflict, not only of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but of the entire Middle East, is the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right?
Right.
And the core of that conflict are Israeli settlements. So we've reached this peace agreement with the Emiratis without really making peace with the Palestinians. Palestinians are sitting off of the table. We haven't ripped up a single settlement. We haven't uprooted any Israeli. Completely disproved. And perhaps the last assumption, and I think in many ways the most damaging assumption, has been that the Palestinians, as supposedly the weaker party, always have to be incentivized and rewarded, especially, get this, especially when they leave the table. Now, the Palestinians have left the table repeatedly since the 1930s. They actually hold the world's record for people who have been offered a state and have turned it down, usually with violence. And they did it to George Bush. They did it to Bill Clinton. They did it to Barack Obama, the most pro-Palestinian president in history. For 8 years, they told him to take a powder. And every time they left the table, they got more money. They got an embassy in Washington, right? They got recognized by 135 states in the world. I mean, who would ever go back to the table, doing so well by leaving the table? So along comes this administration, along comes this peace plan. Says, no, you leave, you're going to pay a price. If you leave, we, the Americans, are going to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We're going to cut off aid to UNRWA, the refugee organization. We're going to close the Palestinian embassy in Washington. And guess what? We're going to mediate. We're going to broker a peace between Israel and one of the most influential Arab countries. And, strangely, I think, interesting enough, it probably has contributed more to Israeli-Palestinian peace than all of those incentives. The Palestinians are going to internalize now, John, the time's not on their side. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they start hinting that they're willing to come back to the table. So it's a tremendous revolution. But, and there's one more but, and that is this. It is a wedding with 2 Ds of the most innovative state in the world, the state of Israel. We're ranked number 1 in innovation in the world, with one of the wealthiest states in the world. And that's going to be transformative, not just for the entire Middle East, but I think for the world.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think people haven't grasped the economic and corporate opportunities that this partnership is going to bring. I mean, obviously we focused on the peace, which is important, but you have 2 economic powerhouses now working together in a region that needs economic growth and economic stability. It seems like that's going to be, one of the big payoffs for sure.
I can't tell you how many businessmen I've talked to here in Israel who have received already letters from their counterparts in the Gulf saying, we want to do business.
Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
Wow.
It really is. Quite miraculous.
It really is. When you look at the table now, one of the dynamics you talked about is essentially the U.S. and Israel for the first time walked from the table and said, listen, you guys want to keep quitting on negotiations. We're going to go do other things. I think you've hinted at this. Does this bring everybody back to the table maybe in a more constructive way? Is that the end game here, hopefully?
I think if the Palestinians internalize that every time they leave, they're going to pay a price. If they internalize the time is not working on their side, it's against them. And that eventually, not just the UAE, but Oman, Bahrain, Sudan, more of the 22 Arab countries will begin to make peace with Israel, and they'll be left behind. Yeah. And here's an interesting part of my biography that's usually not known. I've been involved in this process for, it's kind of scary to say, close to 30 years, because I served as an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin in the early 1990s. So I have an historical perspective on this whole peace process. And I will tell you that the current peace plan is the most realistic peace plan I've seen. It's the only one with a whiff of a chance of succeeding. And it is a very good plan for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, for everybody. If the Palestinians miss this one, it will be yet another, not just a missed opportunity, a terrible historic tragedy for them.
How it is true, and it's obviously a very important time and reevaluation for the Palestinians. When about a week or 2 before the deal was announced, I was talking to a Trump official and I said, hey, listen, brush up on the art of the deal. There's something coming down the road, and you'll understand why I asked you to go back and look at the president's old book, Art of the Deal. And when you go back, and I did, and he always said the best way to get a deal is know what a person wants and know what their biggest fears are, and then try to navigate between those 2 beacons. It seems as though the Trump administration did something that the Palestinians have never seen before, which is, we've had enough. We don't need a deal with you right now. We're going to go on. Does that sort of emanate from a classic CEO's negotiating strategy?
Yes, that, and also there's another little aspect of Trump diplomacy, which is very much is different from previous administrations, which is, in previous rounds of the peace process, and I participated in these, if someone says, we don't like this plan, They come back in 2, 3 days and get a better plan. So the incentive is, of course, to reject the plan.
Of course.
But under this administration, the message went out: if you don't accept this plan, the next plan is going to be worse for you. And the next plan after that's going to be even worse for you. And I think that comes out of not of diplomacy, but out of the business world.
Wow.
I was fortunate to be involved in this process as well. I spent 4 years as the deputy minister in Prime Minister Netanyahu's office.
Right.
And went to the White House several times to talk about the peace process. And I think the major message I brought, again, for this sort of historical perspective, which is, if you give the Palestinians the veto over the process is not going to go anywhere. Because the Palestinians really don't have yes in their vocabulary. They've never said yes. They always walk away. And your plan will die. Direct the plan, not at the Palestinians. Direct them at the Sunni Arab states like the UAE, and direct them at the mainstream of the Israeli public, because they're the people you have to convince. And I can't take credit for this. I think they've heard me, but this is precisely what this plan does.
Yeah.
And it's saying to the Israeli public, here's a good deal. This is the best deal you're going to get. It's saying to the Arab world, jump on this now, and you will get security and defense against Iran, and you'll get innovation from Israel. And it's saying to the Palestinians, you're not going to join it? You lost out again. But we're not going to wait for you this time. We're not. And I think it's a game changer. I really do, John.
Yeah, and as more Gulf states join, the stronger the message is that the region's moving on from this endless negotiation that's gone on for decades. Speaking of the next Gulf states, if you look out over the Gulf and Arab states, who do you think is the most likely next candidate to do a deal with Israel, to open up relations, to build this coalition beyond UAE? Do you have any favorites in mind as you look at the region?
Well, when I was ambassador, I had good relations with almost all of these countries, not publicly for the most part, quietly. Right. Now it can be public. I would expect the Bahrainis, the Omanis to join in pretty soon, perhaps the Sudanese. But what I think is going to happen is when other Arab leaders see that this relationship between UAE and Israel is highly profitable, and that those who don't get on the bandwagon now, are going to lose out, then they will then rush to join as well, because a precedent has been set.
Yeah, and you look at the region; it's been so oil and energy dependent for so long, but there's a limit to that economy. You can only go so far, and when gas prices or oil prices fall, those countries feel the sudden impact of that. The opportunity, it seems, for the region is to create a diversified economy, like Israel's had for a long time, but to spread that all through the region. Do you see, what industries do you see, obviously tourism I've heard a lot about in the last week or two, but what other industries are likely to blossom in this region as a result of the sort of transnational partnerships that are forming?
Well, it's high-tech agriculture. Israel is a leader in high-tech agriculture. It is autonomous driving. Again, we're the world leaders in autonomous driving. It is 3D printer. I don't want to belabor this, but we're the leaders in 3D printing. It is cybersecurity. Israel, we're only about 10 million people. We account for about 20% of the world's investment in cybersecurity. Very, very high. But I think really going to be the truly transformative technology will be in water. So just give you a couple of statistics. Israel reclaims about 90% of its water.
Wow.
The country that comes after us is Spain, that only reclaims 13% of the water. So we're leagues ahead of everybody else. We are the most advanced water desalination plants in the world.
Right, that I'm familiar with.
I have been involved in technologies that, on one hand, create water out of air. I'm not kidding you about this. Water out of air, very good water out of air, as well as water from hydrogen and ammonia, where the byproduct is water and energy. Just amazing. Electricity and energy from hydrogen and ammonia. These are going to take off. These are going to take off in a region which is parched. We are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I learned a lot about the desalinization and the Israeli leadership on that a few years ago on a project, and it's really remarkable. We take for granted in the United States that we get plenty of rain. California maybe not in the Southwest, but most of the U.S. has a lot of water, and we just take for granted the
and you're not going to be able to
supply.
very long. I did a lot of traveling out in the Midwest. I met with governors in Oklahoma and Kansas. Right. And they told me something that totally astonished the Israelis, which was that farmers in Kansas and Oklahoma don't pay for water.
Yeah.
And
isn't that amazing?
What? Don't pay for water? And then you wonder why you run out of water.
Right.
You may have to start changing a little bit of the mentality of the free water.
Absolutely. No, that is true. Population growth clearly puts that pressure on that amazing asset. When you look at this dynamic, and now there's a significant momentum in the region, what are the biggest impediments? What could get in the way of the growth of this extraordinary moment that occurred a couple of weeks ago?
Well, what could get in the way is what often has gotten in the way, which is terror.
Right.
And it's one of the paradoxes of any peace process. You think that peace is going to bring, well, peace. And every time we've made any movement for peace, it has brought the terrorists out of the woodwork, because they're going to do their utmost to try to block the peace. It happened after Anwar Sadat came to Israel. He was assassinated.
Right.
It happened even during the Oslo years. We had all the terrible terror here. So be prepared, for example, for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, not coincidentally, both of them backed by Iran, which is the world's largest state sponsor of terror, to try to block this. To try to block it by the way they know best, for which they're best equipped, is by shooting at people and trying to kill people.
Yeah, that's been definitely the pattern. And Lebanon obviously is in a world of hurt itself after the explosion, the collapse of their government.
What a horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
What a horrible tragedy. Unnecessary.
But
and we offered to help them, and they slapped our hand away.
Wow.
It's a shame, because we helped thousands of wounded from the Syrian civil war.
Right.
And we would have been there for them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a dynamic that is going to be difficult to watch. I think Lebanon is going to probably be a challenge for the region and for the United States for some time. Speaking of Iran, Iran is the odd man out in this deal again, and I wonder what message you think diplomatically, militarily, this new opportunity, this new movement presents to Iran. What message would Israel, the United States, like Iran to hear from this?
Well, the message is now there is an open alliance against Iran. An open alliance against Iran. Iran is facing punishing sanctions from the United States. There's no end running those sanctions by going to the Europeans or others. And the Iranians are going to have no choice, depending on the outcome in November, to be very frank with you, but to return to the negotiating table. And even President Trump said he's willing to negotiate with them. At which point, I think Israel is going to have to make a decision. We're going to have to come out and say specifically what we think a good deal would look like. Right. Now, I tell you, honestly, we didn't do this in 2015 at the time that President Obama negotiated that agreement, and enabled some of the proponents of that agreement to claim that no deal was good enough for Israel. Well, it wasn't true. There are very specific things we need from that deal. We need a true dismantling of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. We need an end to supporting terror. We need Iran to come clean on its previous nuclear military activity. We need truly invasive inspections by the international community. We need all these things. And we need an end to the intercontinental ballistic missile program, which, by the way, is not aimed at us, it's aimed at you. You don't need an ICBM to hit Israel. You need one to hit Washington.
Right.
And I think that all these demands should be on the table. We have no desire to see the Iranian people suffer. We have thousands of years of history with these people. Until 1979, we were allies. But we don't want that. It's this regime, and this regime has to know that if they want to keep their nuclear program, they will not be able to survive economically, and they'll be facing a united strategic front against them in the Middle East.
Is regime change the only solution in Iran, or could you imagine a scenario where a deal is struck with the current leadership that could meet the conditions that satisfy Israel, the United States, the Europeans?
Well, I'm going to surprise you with my answer, and that is it's almost irrelevant.
Wow.
Because an Islamic Republic regime, which basically gives up jihad, it gives up trying to conquer the Middle East. It gives up trying to conquer Jerusalem and Mecca and Medina, which ceases to support terror, is not the same regime anymore. It is actually a regime that will have changed itself.
That's a great point. You're exactly right. You mentioned the election, and I'd love you to turn your attention for a second to America,
Yeah.
because a lot will depend around the world on who's president the day after the election, whether we're going to have another 4 years of Trump or the first 4 years of a Biden presidency. How is Israel? How is the region? How is the rest of the world looking at this election right now?
Well, let's take it from an Israeli perspective without getting involved in the election, and that is this. I know the former vice president well. I know the former senator well, and their relationship to Israel is very, very strong. I mean, think of all the candidates that were running in the Democratic ticket; they're the strongest.
Yeah,
And
he has a good record on it. That's right.
And they've come out recently to say they'd never use U.S. aid as a matter of sort of arm twisting Israel. All that's great. There are policy differences and substantive policy differences. One of them relates to the Palestinians. I would assume that if Biden and Harris were elected, they would jettison the Trump peace plan, go back to the Obama and Clinton peace plans, which I think are unworkable. They would probably reopen that Palestinian embassy in Washington and renew support for UNRWA. I don't think they'd move the American embassy back to Tel Aviv, but other issues there, and they would oppose the Israeli settlement building in a way that the Trump administration has not. But I think even a bigger policy difference will be over Iran, because both Kamala Harris and former Vice President Biden have said that they will renew the Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
Now, understand that for us, that's a strategic danger. That's not a political issue. That's a matter of the security of our children and grandchildren. And we'll have to be vocal about that. So that is going to be very important. Basically, overall, without any reference to Democrats or Republicans, Israel, like the UAE, like virtually every state that is allied with the United States in this region, has the same interest. That is a strong, united to the greatest degree America. Disturbed by a campaign right now where both parties seem to be couching it as existential. If the other guy wins, it's the end of the country.
Right.
A country that seems uncertain how best to police itself, right, is certainly uncertain about how to police the world. And we have all relied on America being the global policeman.
It is a remarkable scene. Now, you've dealt with violence in Israel, usually internal violence, terrorism for a long time, and Israelis have internalized it and been able to create a system that prospers and keeps your country safe in spite of the threats. This is new to us as we look around. We're just not used to seeing cities aflame and officers being attacked the way we have. As an outsider, being from Israel, is there anything we can learn from the Israeli experience as we try to gain some control over the violence, over some of the tactics that have been used in recent weeks to sow chaos and violence in our cities?
It is difficult because there are aspects of American society which are not sort of indigenous to Israeli society, or even in many ways to Middle Eastern society. And I'll give you two examples which are actually closely related. One is gun ownership. Okay, so typical Israeli question I get when I was in Washington is, why do Americans need so many guns? They have the strongest army in the world. Why do they need so many guns? And the answer I'd have to give them was, they need so many guns to protect them against the strongest army in the world. Because in America, gun ownership is related to freedom and liberty. True?
Yeah.
Second Amendment. Less than 3% of Israelis own guns.
That's amazing.
In our world, it could be even lower. I imagine in the UAE, it's even lower than that. So it's not, the connection between liberty and guns doesn't exist here.
Wow.
And that's alien. We also have an ability to monitor and map using very sophisticated systems that are not without certain controversy here, but would be completely unacceptable in the United States. They would be seen as infringements on it. And we've encountered this with battling Corona, because so many of our successes in Corona is the fact that, if someone's tested positive, everybody who came in contact with that person, even sort of fleetingly, gets a message on their phone and they're put into immediate quarantine. You can't do that in America, because that's perceived as infringement on liberty.
It does.
So, so the two are closely linked. Gun ownership, which now there's lots of reports about people showing up to these demonstrations with weapons, and that's very dangerous, highly combustible. And the notion that you can't really monitor the way you'd like to because it's not legal in the United States.
Yeah, it's a remarkable that we have such a unique culture built on our Constitution that it's sometimes we forget what it looks like to the rest of the world as they're looking in on our moments of strife for happiness. Um, as you set out now over the next 60 days, there's going to be more movement. Do you think we'll see another deal in the Middle East before the American election, or is that not possible, you think?
It's possible, and I'm sure that if the current president and the current prime minister of Israel have any say in it, they'd strike a deal tomorrow.
Right.
Because it's certainly good politics, and not just is it good for the region and good for Israelis and good for Arabs, but it's also very good politics. It's a great photo op, as both as presidents learned from Clinton learned and Jimmy Carter learned. Everyone wants that White House moment, that South Lawn moment where
Yes,
they're
the
standing
handshake.
like this, and there's an Arab on one arm and an Israeli on another arm. That's they all want this.
Yep.
It's a great moment. So of course they want it. But each of these countries have their internal dynamics, and I'm sure they want this agreement. I'm sure they want it. And they just
Yeah.
it's a matter of the Middle East operates according to a different clock than even Western societies. Clocks were illegal in the Middle East until the 18th century. People didn't
No
want
kidding.
clocks. And in the Middle East, often you say to someone, "I'll see you in an hour." It could be 2 days.
That's
Different senses of time.
Isn't that funny?
Very different.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that necessarily the Ahmadis or the Bahrainis or others are going to be looking at either the American electoral clock or internal Israeli politics. They have their own considerations, but I'm deeply, deeply convinced that they want this agreement.
Yeah, no, I've been talking to some of the ambassadors here in town for some of the Gulf states and other Arab nations. There's clearly a desire to make this happen, but I think you're right. The internal politics of each country, the cultural mores they have to address, and jumping into this new universe is probably going to take some time for some and maybe faster for others. Last but not least, I want to ask a little bit about the state of affairs in Israel with the prime minister. There's the corruption investigation. There's all the different dynamics. How is Israel doing, and what will it look like 6 months from now? When you look out over the horizon, there's power sharing, there's all these different dynamics, but what do you see the next 6 months of Israeli politics looking like?
I always say I'm a historian and I have enough problems predicting the past. Nobody knows, but my gut feeling, and my gut feeling is often on target, is that there won't be elections, that nobody wants elections right now.
Right.
Netanyahu is not getting stronger, he's getting weaker. There's disaffection, certainly with the handling of the corona crisis, deep disaffection about our economic morass. We have the highest level of unemployment in recent memory, probably going back to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. People are desperate, in many cases hungry. We've really taken quite a blow from this. And as America and the world continue to reel from the corona epidemic, those reverberations are going to affect us as well. We do trade. Something in the order of 35% of our trade is just with Western Europe alone. Today, India announced just catastrophic economic consequences of corona, and India is a major trading partner for Israel, particularly in the area of water. So it's going to be a roller coaster, and in that period, a government that was formed to fight corona, it's a corona coalition, is not going to want to go to elections so quickly. And so I don't think that's going to happen. And here's an interesting point, maybe hard for some Americans to grasp, is that with this, as I said, game-changing peace between Israel and the UAE, it has had almost no impact on the polls.
Amazing.
Because people say, "Oh, that's great, UAE," but what about them?
Something so historic, right? Yeah.
How do I feed my kids? And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how much the pandemic has changed the entire global structure and changed even just the immediate day-to-day concerns of each individual and each society. It's when they say it's a game-changing event, they mean it. So,
well, Mr. We don't even know what game we're in. Never mind changing.
That's right.
We don't.
Yeah, no.
I just to say, going back to the short story book, to the Night Archer. I'm now writing my second collection of short stories, and some of these short stories deal with pandemics. And and it's even writing a short story about it is a moving target.
Yeah, it is.
Because nobody knows.
Nobody knows. That's right. Every time we think we got something licked, it moves, and it's
It
one of the
moves.
great challenges
The
of
movie target.
all of our extraordinary talents that we have today and all our scientific know-how. This one has still evaded us for a while. Last question for you, sir, because I
Very
want to let you
humbling,
go.
isn't it? Isn't it humbling?
It is. It is. Some of that vulnerability in Night Archer, when you read that, yeah, you feel some of that vulnerability today. Why can't we solve this? We're so used to beating things, and this one has humbled us in ways that I think we'll remember for a long time. So last question for you, sir. I always like to ask this question of folks who've had such an important life and had such an impact on public life. What's next for you beyond your writing and your next fiction stories and your great work you're doing? What things on your checklist, your bucket list of things you want to accomplish are still ahead for you?
Well, I've always had my life has always been bifurcated. And that is, on one hand, I'm a writer, and it's intensely personal and important to me. On the other hand, I'm a person of service. And I think, unfortunately, John, those two halves have come to be viewed in many ways as sort of mutually contradictory or exclusive.
Right.
And it wasn't always the case. And this country, in many ways, was founded by a writer by the name of Theodore Herzl. And in America's history also.
Sure.
But great writers are also statesmen. Archibald MacLeish was a big role model for me. And Churchill, not to compare myself so grandly here, but there were people who wrote and led. Yeah. So I remain very active politically here. I'm involved in both an advisory capacity and a commentary capacity, and wouldn't rule out future roles for me in government and diplomacy. That's
a good summary. We'll be watching to see how that unfolds. Mr. Ambassador, I can't thank you enough. Congratulations on the book.
Yeah, thank you.
It's an amazing read. I just couldn't put it down last night, and I'm going to finish it tonight. I'm determined.
So finish the rest of it. I want to hear what you think about the rest of it. I'm anxious to see.
I certainly will. We wish you well with the book and with all the endeavors you have in the future with Israel and America in the great region that is the Middle East. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Be well. Be healthy.